evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's very exciting to be at Politics in the Pub. I'm very used to being in pubs and very used to talking about politics, but not usually at the same time, so I'm very glad to be here. So the question we're looking at tonight is, does education need reform? And what I hope to persuade you of this evening is the fact that actually we have no choice but to reform. That we have a system in Australian education that actually has long outlived its use-by date. And what I want to argue tonight is that there are some really practical things that schools, organisations and institutions can engage with to ensure that we actually shift education from a space of being largely not largely irrelevant, but largely irrelevant for what students are going to need in the 21st century and beyond. It's a stunning fact that the kids that are entering kindergarten this year will leave our schooling system in 2031. And in 2031, the world that they see will be very radically different to the world that we live in now. And in fact, the kids that started school 17, 18 odd years ago entered school in a very different world to the one that they've come into university in the last few weeks that we're seeing them in our lecture halls. I want to set the scene by talking about a concept that Ziauddin Sadar talks about, of postnormality. Ziauddin Sadar is a Muslim theologian and futurist. He's actually a fantastic futurist, and he talks about this idea of postnormality, which is all that was normal has now evaporated. We've entered post-normal times, the in-between period, where old orthodoxies are dying, new ones have not yet emerged, and nothing really makes sense. To have any notion of a viable future, we must grasp the significance of this period of transition, which is characterised by complexity, chaos, and contradiction. So Ziauddin Sadar's rather bleak outlook is that in terms of where we are in human history, we're at a moment where complexity and chaos and contradiction are reigning. And my view is that we really need to think about how we respond to that issue, how we find ways to prepare our students for a future which is less certain than the generations that's gone before. Ziauddin Sadar's response to that is to say this: the most important ingredients for coping with post-normal times are imagination and creativity. Why? Because we have no other way of dealing with complexity, contradiction and chaos. We have to imagine our way out of the post-normal times. The kind of futures we imagine beyond post-normal times would depend on the quality of our imagination. Now, part of what I'm going to argue this evening is that creativity and imagination, which have been, I think, bred out of secondary schooling at least, and certainly of primary schooling to a certain extent, need to be rethought and reimagined and reintegrated into the very basics of what we do at school. And my argument is that we need to stop perfecting the steam train of education. We've had I love steam trains, by the way. I ride on steam trains. I go to other countries to ride on steam trains. I think they're amazing. But they are no longer the form of transport of choice. They are an old way of getting around based on old power sources to do old things. And if you're following my metaphor, my view is that our current education system is a bit of a steam train. And just tinkering around the edges is not going to do it. We need reform that is holistic, we need reform that is radical, and I think we need reform that puts at the centre of schooling some of the capacities that we require for 21st century living. Andy Hargraves, who's a great philosopher and theorist in education, says this: instead of fostering creativity and ingenuity, more and more school systems have become obsessed with imposing and micromanaging curriculum uniformity. In place of ambitious missions of compassion and community, schools and teachers have been squeezed into tunnel vision of test scores, achievement targets, and league tables of accountability. Now, I should also say that Rachel may radically disagree with everything I'm saying, and that's okay. That's the excitement of being able to argue and be able to have different kind of takes in these kind of events. So my argument is, and you'll have seen on the front of the papers the discussion around NAPLAN over the last few years. Now, on its face, there was actually nothing wrong with NAPLAN as a diagnostic for schools and schooling. What happens when you make NAPLAN a public test and you allow league tables to be created is you create unhealthy competition, in my view, between schools. And you create a market in schools in a very narrow band. I mean, NAPLAN looks at literacy and numeracy and certain other acuities, but it doesn't in any way look at all of schooling and all of the opportunities of schooling. And it never claimed to. And so we've got this kind of political push at the moment that's coming from the independent sector, that's coming from public schools, that's coming from policymakers to rethink the way that's being constituted. So, if I'm saying there's this reform that's required, and I think that this reform's required, what actually does that mean? Well, I think we need to come to terms with the fact that learner needs are changing. When I went to school, a teacher was somebody who was able to dispense facts, and I was grateful for those facts. Sometimes I was grateful for those facts being dispensed to me. Great teachers, of course, have not been dispensers of facts. They've been unbelievably able to facilitate learning in all sorts of different ways. But I think the traditional view in some places has been that a teacher was the holder and the dispenser of knowledge. And of course, that should have never been the way it was, but it was. With the advent of knowledge that is everywhere, some of it fake, some of it true, we have knowledge at our fingertips. Students have knowledge wherever they need to find it. Facts are free. But understanding is not free. The ability to apply those facts is not free. And of course, that's what learners are in a world where they can get access to that. But of course, they need to understand how to interpret, how to use, how to apply those facts. And I think that's something that is changing and has changed in terms of the way technology has changed the way we access knowledge. I think we need to reconnect with effective learning strategies such as embodiment, enactment and play. Mentioned early childhood, which is very interesting. There's actually a movement in America which is called putting play back into preschool. Putting play back into preschool. And what that signals to me is a system out of control. Because actually, what we know from the neuroscience, what we know from the brain plasticity research, is that play is critical to the way we make connections in the brain. It is critical to the way that we develop social skills. Play is actually central to the way we develop. And yet we've got a movement in America that's putting play back into preschools. Now, I think that's not gone as far as it could have here, but we do have very deep problems when we have kind of thought that we actually have to kind of clamp down on play in preschools. I think the ideas of embodiment, I mean, you will have heard perhaps Ken Robinson's TED talk that where he points out that the body is not just a transport system for the head, for the brain. And of course, in education, we have disembodied our young people. We have worked to disconnect the body from the learning process. My argument is that we should actually be bringing the body back into what's possible in learning and education, because it is critical to the way we learn. Our whole bodies, our sensory systems are critical to the way we learn. And the third thing I want to say is that we need to develop learning that at its centre is transformative both morally and pedagogically. I think the Me Too movement and all of these things that we've been seeing around the way men and women are behaving towards each other, is, especially on International Women's Day, it is critical that we reflect on education's role in building active citizens who understand their place in the world and understand how to work respectfully with others. I actually think that is a role of education. I know that's actually quite contentious, but I actually think that is part of what education can and could do in a transformed, reformed approach. So why is this reform required? What's going on in the world that is making this happen? There's a few things that I think are important here. The integrated and interconnected understanding we need now to solve super complex 21st century problems. The problems of climate change, the problems of international migration movements, the problems of population, the kinds of things I imagine you talk about here week on week. These policy issues are incredibly complex. They are incredibly tied up across disciplines. They are deep and difficult problems to engage with. And yet we still teach in high schools like disciplines don't connect with each other. It's quite possible for a student to go from maths to science to English to drama to music and never understand the connections these things have with each other. And my argument is that we need to be starting to think about how we connect these disciplines, how we create interdisciplinarity in a way that supports our young people in engaging with the kinds of super complex problems that we have in the world. We've got rapid changes in work and the world of work, and I'll talk about that in a little while. And we've got an apparent gap, and this is my main issue in education, between pedagogy and policy. We've had policy work going on for years and years that says that the 4 Cs are critical to learning in creativity, in collaboration, in communication and critical reflection. They're shot through all of our policy documents. And yet when you talk to teachers about how to teach them, they find it difficult to find the support and the systematic structures to make that possible. And in my work and the book that I've produced recently with my co-author Miranda Jefferson, Transforming Schools, we've tried to close that policy pedagogy gap between what is demanded of schools and demanded of teachers and demanded of students, and yet the structures and the pedagogies don't exist. And so closing that gap is crucial. Future of work, I mentioned that earlier. So Osborne and Frey in 2013, 2 Oxford workplace economists, looked at the workplace of the future. And what they found was this: as technology races ahead, low-skilled workers will reallocate to tasks that are non-susceptible to computerisation. Okay? They found that out of 702 occupations, that 47% would become redundant within a decade. Now, Ross Gittins has critiqued this work, amongst other people, and his argument is that it's not going to be anything near as radical as that. But if you look at and if anyone's had any contact with agriculture, you will have seen over the last decade the amount of work shrinking on farms as automation, as big data approaches and AI take over the roles that used to be available to people. You look at law, you look at transport, you can look across the economy, and entry-level jobs for young people are disappearing. Law's a particularly good example. You know, are there any lawyers here this evening? No lawyers here this evening? Oh, well, one lawyer. Excellent. Oh, bush lawyer. Good to hear. I am too, so we can talk later. So the discovery process that young lawyers used to do to get a foothold in kind of legal firms no longer exists, because you can get a computer with AI to do those searches much faster and much more efficiently than the 22-year-old used to do. And so there is all this kind of change going on. What Osborne and Frey say, tasks requiring creative and social intelligence will be the ones that are irreplaceable by this kind of computerisation. So if you are in an area that has creativity or social intelligence involved, that will be the key factor. For workers to win the race, however, they will have to acquire creative and social skills. So these people these Osborne and Frey, Oxford researchers, aren't particularly interested in, you know, the schooling system per se. They're interested in workplace. And what they're saying is that creativity and social skills will be the things that schools need to focus on if their students are going to survive and thrive in this new economy. And the problem is, of course, we're not focusing on those in schools. We're not focusing on creativity. We're not focusing on social skills. We're focusing in what, in my terms, in the steam train system of learning and teaching, when we've got a bullet train that we need to be getting on. But it's not just now. Look at these stats. 1,700 CEOs. IBM did this study in 2012. So, like, roughly 6 years ago. The top 3 things they said they wanted in their employees were not disruptive people. They're not necessarily assertive people or technology savvy. The top 3, collaboration, communication, creativity. 1,700 CEOs across all of these employment categories want those 3 things most of all. And of course, the education system changed radically at that point, and now we have those things as central to everything we do. Unfortunately, we don't. So, how are we going to do that? What are the implications of this issue? Well, I think there's 2. I think we need to prepare our students by teaching the skills which will ready them for a shifting workforce and world. I think we can no longer be complacent around this issue. We need to rethink how schools and schooling are going to be able to be changed to make them places for 21st century living, not for what their parents experienced or what their parents' parents experienced. It's like the steam train. I'm not saying those were bad things, but schools and schooling need to change to respond to these kinds of emerging needs. Secondly, we need to make our schools distinctive, not easily replaced by a computer, by embedding relevant quality learning, enactment, embodiment, the play that I was talking about before. Those things need to be critical to the way we do learning and teaching. I was talking to someone, I did a panel a few weeks ago about can robots replace teachers. I met a guy after the session. I said, "Oh, what do you do?" He said, "Oh, I write algorithms." I said, "Oh, that's interesting. What kind of algorithms do you write?" He said, "Oh, I'm writing an algorithm at the moment to replace teachers, to fix teachers." I said, "Oh, that's great. How will that work?" He said, "Well, when you look at it really, teachers are instructional units, and this algorithm is an instructional unit, so we just need to swap one out for the other." And I said, I thought, well, should I engage him in an argument? At that point, I went and got a beer. But what I should have said is that actually what's going on in schools and with teachers is so much more than instructional units. They are working on students' interpersonal and intrapersonal engagement. They are working on the whole child. They are working on developing young people able and ready to work in this world. And as Arthur C. Clarke said, teachers that can be replaced by a machine should be. And I agree. If you are not developing the whole child, if you are not developing the interpersonal and the intrapersonal, that guy from Piedmont probably does deserve to replace you with an algorithm. But, coming back to where we started, do we need reform? I think we are facing a bunch of challenges in the 21st century which are kind of unprecedented. And I think that we need to reimagine our pedagogy. And the book that I wrote with Miranda talks about the 4 C's. It talks about collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical reflection as being absolutely central to that change. And we don't need to do this by throwing everything out and by, I'm not arguing that we should get rid of literacy and numeracy and reading and spelling. These things are critical to be able to understand the world, but also, it is also critical to be able to develop collaboration skills and creativity skills and communication skills. I think what we don't need is more testing that's disconnected from learning. More standardised tests. We've just got the phonics test. Some of you may have seen the phonics test is coming in for Year 1 students. That's incredibly contentious. I'm not sure that's the right way to be going. I don't think we need more time at school. What we find with high-performing schools is that, and nations, is their time at school actually is not necessarily proportionate to how they're going in kind of as a schooling system. I don't actually think we need more technology. I don't think we need to be deluged with more technology. The problem is that our kids have stopped noticing. When I'm in primary schools and working with high schools, I'm actually teaching kids the skills of noticing and supporting teachers in working in noticing. That is a radical shift. And that's a problematic shift, I think. And it's not the kids' fault. It's the fact that we have bought technology as the panacea for learning when it's not. I'm not against technology. I write about technology all the time, but technology needs to be the thing that suits the learner, not the thing that is imposed upon the learner and the teacher in the school system. I also think that we don't need more inertia or complacency. And I actually think that schooling systems are waking up to this. I think that the teachers I work with, and we work with 20 schools throughout New South Wales, are starting to engage with the need to change their school. They're starting to get excited about the opportunity of actually getting in contact with their first love, which was actually changing lives and being important in the lives of kids. And I don't think we need more talking, which is my cue to shut up in a minute. What I do think we need to do for reform is we need to trust educators. We have an amazing resource in our schools, which is our teachers and our students. We have an unparalleled resource. This is a resource that can bring change, but we need to trust our educators. I also think we need to support learning that engages with human capacities, and I've talked about the 4 Cs. And finally, I want to connect with this idea of critical hope that Augusto Freire spoke about so many years ago. That we are critically hopeful for the future. We don't just hope for anything, but we are focused on the problems in front of us, and we work hard with hope to overcome those problems. And I think if we can instill those things in a reformed schooling system, it will make all the difference and change the lives of our students for the better. Thank you very much.
Excellent.